If you look at the last 20 years, I think the biggest lesson is that all the countries are different. It doesn't really make sense to have a category of ex-communist countries that includes Turkmenistan, Georgia, Moldova, Poland and Estonia, for example. One of the clear factors is that natural resources are more of a curse than a blessing. The countries with big oil and gas or other mineral endowments have done worse since the collapse of communism than the ones that didn't. And I'd include in that natural resource category actually transit. It's been a curse for Ukraine having the rents from transit revenues. I think, contrary to what Karl Marx argued, I think individuals do make a difference. It can be a huge advantage for a country just to have had the right person at the right time. And Leszek Balcerowicz in Poland, for example, or the Mart Laar government in Estonia both got their countries onto a course that has left neighbouring countries struggling to catch up. I think that the magnetic power of the EU and NATO was very important. Joining those two big Western clubs involved meeting some pretty tough reform targets, and even people who didn't really understand the reforms understood the advantage of joining the club and pushed them through. I sometimes felt that the same people who'd obeyed the commissars in Moscow so dutifully were obeying the commissioners in Brussels with equal dutifulness and diligence. And that wasn't a bad result in the end. It provided a template for the way a society ought to run, both in economic and political and judicial terms, which was very beneficial. What worries me now is that when these countries are in the EU and in NATO, that pressure to reform and to run the country properly has got less. And we see this now with Romania and Bulgaria, where the European Union's having some difficulty in trying to keep the progress in the judicial and criminal justice system. I think NATO enlargement is still potentially an important carrot, and we'll see that very clearly at the Chicago summit. It's going to be a really tricky question there. What do they say to Georgia, which has made the military and security forms that NATO wants, but faces reluctance among the European members in NATO to give it what the Georgians feel is the right reward for that? I think that the chances in Moldova probably paradoxically are the best, because the things are so bad there. There's no ready source of money for keeping things bad, and there's big advantages for getting them right. And the presence of next door Romania provides an example of how nice life is if you have an EU passport. It doesn't necessarily mean you live in your home country, but at least you can travel. So the freedom of movement, the openness to foreign investment, and the other things that close association or even membership of the EU brings are very attractive for Moldova. Ukraine is in a different category, I'm afraid, because the Ukrainian leadership seems to be determined to try and do as much damage to the country as possible, both in terms of its reputation and in terms of its governance. So that's a severe disappointment and a difficulty. And of course, Belarus is in a category all on its own. It has the same relation to Europe as Pluto does to the solar system. Unfortunately, we've just seen judicial murder of two innocent teenagers whom the authorities wanted to use as convenient vehicles for the blame for a terrorist outrage that every sign is the authorities themselves have perpetrated. So that's in a completely separate category, and I don't think there's anything much to be expected there. I believe rather unfashionably that shock therapy is the right approach. If you've got to make difficult decisions, make them at the time when your political capital is still high, and then they may have started to pay off by the time people get really fed up. So if you have price liberalisation, get it done. If you have macroeconomic stabilisation to do, get that done. If you need to open the economy up to foreign trade, get that done too, because you're going to have to do it sooner or later. I think that the best thing that Tunisia can hope for is a generous free trade agreement with the European Union. That would be immensely important. It's very difficult because the countries inside the European Union that would suffer the initial shock of free competition from North African agricultural products are just the ones that are in most economic difficulty at the moment. So I think you'd find rather little enthusiasm in Spain, Portugal, Italy and Greece for opening up the market to, say, Tunisian or Moroccan tomatoes. But that's what you have to do. It's much better to stabilise the periphery by making it prosperous than try and build a kind of new Berlin Wall or Mediterranean cordon and keep the people there on the other side, because they will get through and you get poverty, migration, terrorism and all sorts of other problems. I think it's a kind of moral Chernobyl, the legacy of the secret police past. It spews out pollution and distorts things, and also because it's not always visible, it creates all sorts of public panics. I think one has to start off on the basis that there are many things in the files that are not true, and there are many things that are not true that aren't in the files. And so the idea that the secret police files provide an accurate mirror of the past is quite wrong. But I do think you have to try and deal with them openly and fairly. And I think actually the German system, the Gaukbehörde, and this is Joachim Gauck, who's now the president of Germany, I think that's probably the right way to do it. I strongly dislike the idea that you keep it all locked up and then selected individuals are allowed access to the files to settle their own political scores by leaking things selectively. But I think the broader question is what you do about the justice system altogether. And there's a real problem there. You can't get new judges from nowhere. You can't get new lawyers from nowhere. You can't get new prosecutors from nowhere. So inevitably you will be dealing with the people who were, in some cases, perpetrators of the crimes of the past, and that's very difficult. I think you have to try and set some sort of deadline. You have to accelerate the transition as much as possible. And I think one of the huge problems in countries like Slovakia, for example, and Romania and Bulgaria is that the judiciary got independence before it was reformed. So you're then stuck with judges who are, in many cases, either incompetent or corrupt or both. And they're almost unsackable because they say we have the constitutional protection, and that was a requirement of EU membership. So I think one has to be very careful about trying to balance the stability of the judicial system, which is very important, with its integrity, which ultimately is even more important.